Welcome to part 2 of my transparent watercolor paint along Edge of Furnace Run. This is the skills exercise. This skills exercise has 4 components. The first component, I will review the colors used in my painting Furnace Run. The second part of the exercise will be a small composition that establishes a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. The third component will be practicing textures to create branches and underbrush. And the fourth component will be creating textures that are representative of ground cover. I begin this exercise by mounting a quarter sheet of 140-pound cold press watercolor paper to my board, and I divide it into 4 sections using masking tape. But you could use scraps of paper, individual squares, however you want to do this. You could even do it on the back of an old painting. The first exercise will be reviewing the colors used in my painting Furnace Run. The second will be practicing with a small composition that helps establish foreground, middle ground, and background. The third exercise is a texture exercise, creating textures that suggest branches and undergrowth. And the fourth is also a texture exercise for textures that give the suggestion of ground cover. So color, composition, and 2 exercises with texture. Once completing this exercise, you should be well on your way with the skills needed to complete this paint along. The first exercise focuses on color. I have 4 groups of color mixtures that I use to accomplish my painting. The first is cobalt blue and rose madder quinacridone, and these are the colors that I use to represent the snow. Sap Green, Pyro Red, and Royal Blue are used for ice and rocks, branches, ground cover. Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna are the colors I use for the tree. And quinacridone Gold and quinacridone Coral I use for various areas of the foliage throughout the composition. My first set of colors is cobalt blue and rose madder quinacridone. So that's the pure cobalt blue, and this is the pure rose madder quinacridone. Now I'm going to move to my palette, and we'll see what that looks like as I work with those colors. I'll begin with pure cobalt blue. I'll put some of that on my palette, and I use that for some of the shadowed areas in the snow, as well as a mixture of the cobalt blue and this rose madder quinacridone. Those 2 colors mixed together give me a nice purple tone. So I use those 2 shades in conjunction with one another to represent shadows in the snow. The cobalt blue directly from my palette, and then this mixture with the rose madder that gives me a variety of kind of a violet tones. Now I'm going to move back to the exercise. So right here to the right of those first 2 brush marks, I'll put the brush marks that represent the colors I use to suggest the snow. And that is the pure cobalt blue that I've just put down. And then the second mark is the mixture of the cobalt blue and the rose madder quinacridone. So those 2 colors work together in my painting to do some of the shadowed areas in the snow. Now I'm going to move on to the second set of colors in my exercise, and that's the Sap Green, the Pyro Red, and the Royal Blue. I use these 3 colors quite a bit in my paintings, whether it be a floral or a landscape or even cityscape. Here's the Pyro Red. And then I'll take the Royal Blue and make a brush mark of that. I'll go back to the palette again, and there's my Sap Green. Next I'll take some Pyro Red, and then finally Royal Blue. As I begin to work with mixing these colors, you'll see that I go back and forth with each of the colors till I get the ratio that gives me the result I'm after. And when using these colors, I use the green and red to drive one another more towards a neutral color, and then I use that royal blue to, one, cool it down, or two, darken the mixture, darken the value. I use these three colors often, and I'm not sure if they should be on everybody's palette, but they're colors that I've become partial to, and color is such a personal thing, and the colors that you have on your palette. As I work on the mixture here on the right side of the palette, what I'm after is a blue-green, kind of a grayish blue-green tone that I can use for the icy water. So it's kind of a blue-green on the right, and it's more of a kind of a dirty gray green on the left of those two puddles that I have there. And now I'm going to take some of that royal blue into this mixture on the left, and green and more red. So I'm putting a heavier concentration of pigment so I can get a darker value, and I want this to be a warm dark value. So this is a color that I'm going to use in some of the dark areas around rocks and some of the branches and underbrush, but it's got a heavier concentration of red than the other tones, which gives me that warm dark value. So on the right I have some of these cool blue-green tones. On the left I have a dark warm value, and I use those colors in a variety of areas in my painting. Now I'm going to go back to the exercise and start putting down some of the brush marks that are representative of the colors that I'll use in my painting for the ice, for the rocks, for some of the branches. So here's one of these kind of cooler blue greens, but it's very gray, but it still leans a little towards green. And this second one, it's hard to see the difference in this video, but it's a little bluer tone, and it's still a good neutral kind of blue-gray that I can use for the icy waters. Now that's a bit warmer, that has a bit more red in the mixture, so it's still about the same value as the other two, but it's a little warm. So these are very subtle differences, but they do affect what's going on in your painting. So now I've got a very dark value, and that mark is still leaning towards cool. And now I'm going to take a mixture that's got a heavier concentration of red in it, and it's a warm dark value. So I know it's kind of hard to see in the video, but what I'm left with is a warm and a cool dark value. Now I'm going to move on to the next set of colors, and it's Ultramarine blue and Burt Sienna. These are kind of a classic combination that people use quite frequently. They complement one another, and you can use them to mix some very nice neutrals. And we'll move back to the palette, and here's my Ultramarine blue, and then I'll take some Burnt Sienna. So these two colors, when mixed together, start to quickly produce some neutral colors, and you can leave it towards the cool side or the warm side. So the more Burnt Sienna in the mixture, the warmer it's going to be. The more Ultramarine blue, the cooler it's going to be. I'll use both the warm and cool versions of this mixture when I paint the tree in my painting. Now I'll go back to the exercise, and we'll put down our brush marks for these mixtures. Here you can see that's still very warm. It's still not pure Burnt Sienna. It's been toned down just a bit, but it's still a very warm tone. And here is a cool brush mark. So those two I can blend on the paper or let mingle, and I can go cooler and warmer still and get the tones I'm after. And here I'm pretty neutral and very dark, but it's like a dark gray. And then my last color combination that I have here is quinacridone gold and quinacridone coral, and they give me kind of an orange tone. I could have used many other color combinations for this, but I chose to use these two colors. And I go back to the palette and take some quinacridone gold and put that on my palette, and then some quinacridone coral. It's a little redder than that actually, got some yellow in there. So there's the quinacridone coral. And when I mix those two together, you can see that I can produce a variety of yellow, gold, orange, or reddish orange colors that I can use on my paper. And I use these colors to represent some of the fallen leaves and foliage that are laying around the ground or hanging on the tree still. You can see here I could take some burnt sienna and put a little of that mixture too, and still change the tone a little bit. And now I'm back to the exercise, and I'll put down a brush mark that's representative of that orange tone that I use in a few spots in my painting. Now I'm moving on to the second exercise, which is a small painting of a small composition to establish a foreground, middle ground, and a background. So I'm just doing a very simple sketch to represent elements that are in the scene of my painting. This would be a tree, and it's going to be in the middle ground. So that's one of the objectives of this paint along, is to get a good feeling for establishing foreground, middle ground, and background in your landscape. So here I've drawn kind of the edge of that middle ground area, and now I'm just putting in a rock shape, and then back here is going to be the suggestion of some snowbanks along the water, and that's an area that's going to be in the background. The idea here isn't to create a mini painting that you're going to frame and hang on your wall. It's just to do a simple watercolor sketch that establishes a foreground, middle ground, and background using some of the approaches that I use in the painting for this paint along. So here I'm giving the suggestion of some snow on the ground, some underbrush, some twigs and saplings coming up, or grassy shapes coming up from the ground. And these are elements that help create overlap in the scene and help establish some distance between different areas in the composition. Part of this painting requires quite a bit of masking. So in this simple exercise, we're just going to do some very basic masking here. And I'm using a fine line masking pen. You could use a brush or whatever you find whatever is part of your normal technique. But I'm just giving the suggestion here of some linear marks that would represent saplings and grass sticking out of the snow. And my main objective here is that these are going to give a sense of overlap with light tones going over darker shapes that will help establish the foreground, middle ground, background relationships. Here in this exercise, I'm keeping it very simple. This is just again, it's intended to be a quick watercolor sketch, but at the end, still trying to establish the difference between the foreground, middle ground, and background. So in this exercise, I'll be dealing with the background, which is this area here. I'll be working with the middle ground, which is this tree and some of these branch elements, and then the foreground, which is the ground cover and some of these, again, branches that are closer. I'm going to begin this exercise here by starting in the background. And this is the area that's going to be farthest back, and some of these other elements are going to overlap it. And that's why I put down the masking, because it preserves that white and allows me to put this big wash down. And then when I remove it, it will create that light linear shape that's going over top of this, creating overlap, and it starts to give a spatial relationship between the two. I'm using that kind of a blue-gray color and for where the icy water is, and then I'm coming in with this violet tone that would be representative of shadows in the snow. This is a very basic sketch that I'm doing just to give a suggestion of some of these elements so that we can establish the three areas being the background, middle ground, and foreground. But this is very similar. This is just simply stated. This is what occurs in my painting, Edge of Furnace Run. Now I'm taking some of the cobalt blue and putting that above the violet tone that I laid down, and then I'm going to switch back to the kind of the neutral blue-gray. There's a lot of ways to show distance in a painting. You can use warm and cool colors to do that. You can use your edges, soft edges that are less defined in the background, your level of detail, value contrast. Those are all different ways that you can help establish distance in your painting. In this very simple watercolor study, the background there is just some cool tones, and there's really no detail. It's just a very simple shape that'll have other shapes overlapping it. Now I'm carrying some of that purple tone into the shadowed areas in the middle ground and close to the foreground, but mostly in the middle ground. Now I'm going to begin working on this tree using a dark value mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. This makes a nice dark neutral, and that dark value helps to bring it closer to you in this instance, because that background is just kind of soft and foggy, and as you get closer to the middle and foreground, the shapes and edges are going to get crisper and the values are going to be darker. I often have my background in a middle value to light value, and my darker tones more middle ground to foreground in a landscape, but there's also times when my darkest values are in the background. It just depends on your particular composition and how you're approaching your painting. Often when I'm doing a floral, it's just the opposite. There's many times when I'm trying to show depth in the deepest part of my painting are where my darkest values are, and my lighter areas are more in the foreground of my composition. So at this point in this sketch, you can start to see I'm establishing a foreground, middle ground, and background. And now, just by some of these brush marks that I'm putting down with these darker values, I'm creating some texture there, but I'm creating overlap, and these marks are going over top of the background, and it starts to create a spatial relationship. And here, as I start to put some of these linear marks coming off the edge there of that snow, again, it kind of pulls that to the middle ground and sets that distant area back. Whether I'm painting a landscape or whether I'm doing a floral or even a cityscape, I try to utilize overlap as a tool to help create depth in my paintings. I'll build layers in florals where I keep building darker and darker values and give the suggestion of shapes moving under other shapes to create that overlap and help build depth. And I do the same thing in a landscape such as this. These simple linear marks overlap the other shapes, and they start to give the indication that they are closer to you than the shape that they're going over. So that helps build depth in my painting. Now I'm going to take my pickup eraser and I'm going to pick up the masking fluid I put down. And you can see where the areas protected now reveal the white of the paper, and they're linear marks, so these give the suggestion again of overlap and help reinforce the feeling of a middle ground, a foreground, and a background. Often when I do a painting like this, what I try to do is build some layers of this overlap. So I'll have a light value over a dark value. I'll have dark values going over light values. and then I'll alternate. I'll have where I have some of these light valued shapes that I've masked off. I'll come back over top of those with a middle or dark value, and I'll end up with a dark value over a light value over a dark value. And that concludes this exercise. This wasn't intended to be something you're going to frame and hang on the wall. It's just a sketch and exercise to learn from. And the objective here was to create a foreground, middle ground, and background using overlap, using value, using warm and cool colors. This next exercise is going to deal with texture and give a suggestion of branches and underbrush. So I'm going to make a few pencil marks here just to give it the indication of a couple shapes. These are just a few linear marks, a couple shapes that are going to represent, say, tree saplings, and those are vertical. I'm going to put the indication of the horizontal sapling too, and I'm going to give the indication of the edge of like a snowbank, and then I'm going to also put a tree trunk shape in here. And what we'll focus on is building branch-like and underbrush textures over and around these shapes that I've drawn. And to do that, we're going to start with some masking fluid again to create this texture and preserve some of the white areas. So I'm putting a bead of the masking fluid on these saplings, and that'll preserve the white in that shape. And I'm going to do the same thing with this horizontal shape that I've placed in there. Then I'm going to start putting some random marks with this very fine line masking fluid pen. So these would be twigs and branches, and depending on where I put them, they could be grassy shapes, the indication of grass. And the one thing where they're random, I'm aware of the direction that I'm going with them. I'm aware of the length of them. I try to break them up, and they crisscross and overlap. So I'm keeping all those things in my mind as I'm doing this. I try to do vertical, I try to do some horizontal, and I group these a lot of times by direction and length. So it starts to form almost a larger shape when they mass together. And you can see I'm coming off the edge of that tree. That gives a suggestion that those shapes are moving out from behind the tree. And again, an overlap creating depth. I have a 1-inch flat brush here, and I'm just making some marks with a very dark value here. And you can see I just randomly put in these marks with some awareness of the direction that they're going, and I put a dark edge alongside where I've masked the saplings, so it'll give a dark edge next to a light edge. And I just kind of rotate my brush as I do this a little bit, and I have these marks coming out from the edge of the tree. When you have shapes like that coming in and ending on something such as that tree where you have an edge, it helps reinforce the feeling that there's an edge there. And a lot of times, like when you're doing negative painting, you really don't even have to do much to the actual object itself because you've done enough behind it to give the suggestion that that edge is there. Continuing to make some of these linear marks here. I'm doing a horizontal linear shape here to give the indication of that sapling that's kind of fallen potentially. Here a little bit more brushwork kind of in a foreground of this little sketch here. I'm going to go ahead and put a dark value on this tree shape. And I still use the 1-inch brush for that. So you can get a lot out of your brush when you use all sides of it, and you can do a lot with a large brush. Next, I'm going to remove the masking fluid that I have down, and you can see a lot of these light marks come out now where I had protected the paper you see all these very linear shapes that have been protected by the masking fluid, and they're overlapping the darker tones that I've put down on the paper. So my next step is to take a liner brush with a dark value, and here I'm going over top of some of those light shapes. So here I have this layer upon layer upon layer where I have dark over light over dark, and these are the things that start to help build overlap and depth in your painting. I want to introduce some color in this, and I'm not going to paint each individual linear mark that I've made with a brush. What I'm going to do is I'm going to load a brush up with some color, and I'm just going to come in and put a light to middle value wash over top of some of these areas, and you'll see the linear marks coming through, but then you'll also see that it picks up that just that overall color for the area. And that completes this very simple exercise to use texture to give the suggestion of branches and underbrush. The fourth and final exercise is also a texture exercise. This one is to create ground cover. So the shapes that I'm going to be making are less linear than in the previous exercise. They're to represent leaves and things that are just laying, stones and whatnot, laying on the ground. So the size is important, the shape's important, the direction and the grouping of them is important, how I lay them there. I want to try and create the feeling that this is a horizontal plane with just ground cover laying all over the place. Now I'm also going to use another technique where I take a toothbrush dipped in masking fluid, and I'll hit this on my hand and create some splatter, and I'll flick the bristles to create some splatter, and this just creates an interesting texture on top of the other marks that I've been putting down with the bottle applicator. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this toothbrush and I'm just going to push it around a little bit in some of these drops so they look less like drops and more like just random areas of value on the surface. With the masking fluid thoroughly dry, I can go in and start laying down values with my paintbrush. Here I've got a one half inch flat brush with a very dark value on it, and I'm painting with the side of the brush and just dragging it in different directions to make some random marks. And dragging it across the dried masking fluid also has an effect on the actual mark that it makes. And you can see here I'm just splattering a little bit of this paint, and a round brush normally does a better job of splattering than a flat brush, so I'm going to grab a round brush here and we'll just flick a little bit of paint down. This will add to the texture, and remember I also did this with a toothbrush, so there will be some light value splatter that works and complements the dark value splatter. So this helps create repetition. Now I'm coming in with a warm sienna tone and making similar brush marks, but just with a different value and color. And here you can see I'm giving the indication of some grass or some weeds growing out of the material that's laying on the ground. So here for this exercise I'm working in some of these linear marks just to differentiate between ground cover and some of this underbrush that's sticking up and growing out of the weeds and the fallen leaves. Now I also have some snow laying around this ground cover, so I'm taking this purple tone and giving the suggestion of shadowed areas on snow and a little bit of cobalt blue. Now my paint's thoroughly dried. I'm going to take a pickup eraser and I'm going to remove the masking fluid. And you can see this reveals a number of white shapes that have been preserved by the masking fluid that I put on. When you're removing the masking fluid, it's always a good idea to take your hand or your fingers and rub it over the surface just to see if you can find any that you haven't removed. Now, some of the areas that I preserved with the white masking fluid, I want to leave white and represent snow. In other areas, I'm going to take this warm wash and put over it and give the suggestion of fall foliage, which has fallen to the ground and has now been snow covered. So that completes the 4 parts of the skills exercise. I'm going to remove this masking tape that divides the sections to give a cleaner look to it. And here you can get a look at all the exercises that were done. The first part of the skills exercise was to review the colors used in the painting from the paint-along. The second exercise was to do a small composition that gave the suggestion of a foreground, middle ground, and background. The third exercise was to create textures that represented branches and underbrush, and the fourth was an exercise to create textures that gave the suggestion of ground cover. So that concludes part 2, the skills exercise portion of this paint-along. If you decided to give these exercises a try, it will give you a good head start if you decide to attempt the painting in this paint-along or another painting like it. Thank you for watching. If you're going to continue on with this paint-along, part 3 will be the narrated step-by-step tutorial. If you have questions, you can reach me by emailing me at contact@rshurwitzart@gmail.com.